In this tape we're going to look at the entire NIMZO Indian complex for black. The NIMZO Indian is one of the most reputable defences to 1d4 there is. It's been used by world champions such as Fischer, Karpov, Kasparov, and is widely regarded as one of the best equalising weapons there is. We're going to start off by looking sort of right to left, broadly speaking, at the various white systems that can be tried. So we start off then with the move, after the introduction of course, 1d4, knight f6, 2c4, e6, 3 knight c3, bishop b4, the immediate fianchetto of the white king bishop starting with the move 4g3. Now 4g3 was no big shakes for an awful long time. It was first played I think by Alexander Alekhine back in the 1940s I think. But it is interesting, it has been revised somewhat by the patronage of Oleg Romanishin and no less a figure than G. Kasparov. It's true Kasparov didn't actually use the move order of 4g3, but he did in his recent World Championship match with Karpov try the idea of king's fianchettos against NIMZO Indian, sometimes prefacing them with 4 knight f3 and only then subsequent g3. But let's look at the move 4g3 and possible black systems against them. Now it seems to me there are, well, at least a few ways, meaning that I don't regard g3 as being an earth-shaking idea, at least a few ways of equalising for black here. But one of the most simple to follow, I think, is the system which Karpov used in game 17 of the last World Championship match. Commencing with the move after g3, c5 for black. Now, the only really consistent idea for white here is to play 5 knight f3 as Kasparov did, because the reply 5d5 would allow all sorts of sensible setups for black, including just taking on d5 and following up with d6. Or those with more aggressive spirits might like to try the immediate reply 5b5, a sort of quasi-Blumenfeld counter-gambit against the move d5 for white. Anyway, the move 5 knight f3 as played by the world champion, the new world champion, is the most logical one. Now, taking on d4 certainly makes sense here for black, but the system I'm going to advocate and look at is the move 5 knight to c6. And after Kasparov's 6, bishop g2. Once again, there are several plausible looking moves for black, but the one Karpov played is knight e4, an immediate use of the pin, the classic NIMZO Indian pin. The unpinning move from Kasparov is bishop d2. Now the move after bishop d2, if black were to take on d2, I think it's probably a move leading to objective equality or thereabouts, but it seems to me far more in the vein of the NIMZO Indian is to play the move bishop takes c3, which enforces a doubling of the white c-pawns, classic theme in this opening. Kasparov took back with the pawn on c3. Had he taken back with the bishop, then consistent with what I'm saying, you won't be surprised to hear that knight takes c3, once again forcing a doubling of the c-pawns, is the best move. By taking back with the pawn at b2 immediately, Kasparov hopes to at least retain the 2 bishops. So after the reply b2 takes c3, the move 8 castles for black. And Kasparov chose the castle here, which I think is as productive a move as any. Here at move 9, Karpov produced the move knight to a5. Which made Kasparov think for 43 minutes in his reply. I think this move probably does objectively equalise. There's no really convenient way of defending c4. Kasparov came up with the move d takes c5, voluntarily tripling his c-pawns. And rather than recapturing immediately, Karpov played queen to c7. Here again, after a monster think of 40 minutes, Kasparov came up with knight d4. And we'll follow this game for a few more moves, but it's reaching the stage now where there are many possibilities for both sides. But the structure is well defined, and these blockading black knights and the doubled or tripled white c-pawns, the clearest and easiest features to understand. So 11 knight d4 was played in game 17 of the World Championship. Karpov took on d2. Kasparov, of course, recaptured. And then 12 knight takes c4 from Karpov. After which Kasparov produced a somewhat fantastical move, queen g5. f6 played Karpov. Queen to f4 played Kasparov. And now the move e5 would be met by bishop d5 check and knight b5, which is no good at all for black. Instead of that, at move 14, Karpov played the move knight e5. And now to defend his attacked pawn at c5, Kasparov was more or less constrained to play knight b3, to which Karpov replied with rook b8. And here we'll leave the opening analysis and say that b6 is going to follow, and black is in no real difficulty. He follows up with b6, bishop b7, exchanging bishops, and he has no real structural weaknesses to worry about. And it's comfortably equalised. This system, it seems to me, is a very straightforward one. There are other more ambitious tries for black against the move 4g3, involving the doubling of the c-pawns and then the attempt to erect some sort of pawn formation like d6 and e5. There is also the idea of reaching g3 with a straightforward d5, something like the Catalan opening, except that the bishop is on b4 instead of the usual e7. But I think the system is to be recommended for its simplicity. It's very easy to follow. My last comment upon it is if we go back to the position after, this is at move 10, after g3, move 5, move 4, beg your pardon, confusing myself, g3, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop g2, knight e4, bishop d2, bishop takes c3, pawn from b2 takes c3, castles, castles, knight a5. After 43 minutes, Kasparov played d takes c5. The other possibility, which really should be commented upon there, is the move bishop to f4. And I once looked at this position with Grandmaster Raymond Keane, and we decided that the reply to bishop f4, pawn from d7 to d5 for black, even though it involves an undoubling of the white c-pawns, is a good equalizing try. Because after the continuation, let's say 10 bishop f4, d5, 11 c4 takes d5, e6 takes d5, d takes on c5. If black now plays the developing move bishop e6, I think his game is completely okay. So with that, we have the main important outlines of a defence against 4g3. Okay, the next thing we'll look at is the move 4f3, which is even rarer than 4g3. Now 4f3 looks a bit chunky and ungainly because it takes away the natural developing square of the king's knight. I mean, after the moves 1d4, knight f6, 2, c4, e6, you don't see people playing 3f3. So what's he got going for it in this position? Well, one of the principal ideas of the move f3 is on the next move for white to follow up with a3, which could well force transposition into a line of the same-ish variation, which begins with 4a3. We'll look at that later on. But I want to suggest a continuation for black now against 4f3 into lines independent of the same-ish system. So against 4f3, let's look at the move 4c5 for black. And the most consistent white replies now are either d5 or a3. In fact, no other move really makes any sense for white. So look at the move 5d5. Now, the most usual move in this position, somewhat esoteric and leading to rather weird complications, is the move 5 knight to h5. Now, this funny looking move has the idea of following up with f7 to f5, which is thought to be a good idea. And the move knight h5 has the incidental threat of queen to h4 check. So white usually takes time out to play g3 and stop that. But enough of 5 knight h5. Let's look at a much more straightforward move. 5 bishop takes c3 check. Pawn takes c3 and then d6. And what we have in front of us now is typical of so many of the positions we'll look at in the whole NIMZO complex, where it's more a question of understanding than concrete variations. The position is blocked, and I recall a remark made by Grandmaster Robert Byrne about blocked positions. It's rather like all the pieces get bogged down in a sticky suet pudding. And this is what may happen in these positions where there is very restricted piece activity. Look at the game Serawan Anderson from Indonesia, 1983. After d6, Serawan played the perfectly natural 7e4, and Anderson played 7e5. So there you have a pawn structure established now, which we'll see quite a few times in this tape. This game continued 8, bishop d3, knight from b8 to d7, 9, knight e2. There are many ways black could play it now. He in fact played h6. White played 10, knight g3, and then 10, knight to f8, blocking his own development. But it's a blocked position, so the development race we normally associate with the earliest opening moves isn't so much important here. 11, rook b1 from Serawan. Again, there are many plausible alternatives for both sides. It's just the sort of structure we're looking at, rather than rehearsing a concrete sequence. 11, queen to c7, played Anderson. 12, castles. And Anderson played the alert move g7 to g5, hoping to follow up with knight to g6, knight to f4, the complete clamp on the white king side, and then castle queen side himself. We'll stop our consideration of the merits of this formation here. I repeat, it's more a question of understanding than concrete memorization, and there were many alternatives for both sides in that sequence. But the structure remains very fixed, very easy to follow where the pieces are going. So that's the move 5d5. If we go back to the position after 4f3, c5, the other move I mentioned, the only other consequent continuation for white is 5a3. Now 5 bishop takes c3 check in response to a3 is of course a perfectly good move, but it does force transposition into the same-ish line, which can call for great accuracy on black's part. If you're not careful, you can really get done over in the same-ish. Because whereas white does have doubled pawns, he also has an extremely strong centre, which forms the basis for a potential very dangerous kingside attack. So one reply to the move 5a3, which doesn't lead to the same-ish variation, is the retreat 5 bishop a5. Now were white to take on c5 now, black would then take on c3, and the triple c pawns are no fun at all for white. So again, it's a question of what consistent moves can be found. And really there's very little else which is consistent in the move 5d5 here. Sorry, 6d5. Because the move 6e3 is leading to the sort of formation we'll find when we come to consider the whole system with 4e3 later on in the tape, the Rubinstein variation, where white has played the somewhat ungainly move f3. Not out of the question to play 6e3 after the retreat bishop a5, but one would like to have that f3 square vacant for a knight. So the move 6d5. And here too, of course, the move bishop takes c3 check makes a great deal of sense. The only difference to the previous variation being that the white pawn is moved from a2 to a3, which does not alter the structure of the position very greatly. But equally viable, I think, is the move 6 castles for black, answering 7e4 with 7d6. And there are many, many ways of playing it now for both sides. But I think the structure is perfectly sound for black. And we give the moves of the game Georgiou Spassky from 20 years ago as an illustration of how viable this is. So there it is, the rarely encountered continuation 4f3. And I think the move c5, as indeed with the move 4g3, is a simple equalizing idea. The third system we'll examine is what was described by Alexander Alekhine as the best move against the NIMZO Indian. He thought it was the best because A, it avoided the doubling of the c-pawns, and B, it controlled the move, the square e4, prepared the advanced e4 for white. And this move is 4 queen c2. Nevertheless, despite the eulogizing of A. Alekhine, I feel that here too, the best reply for black at move 4, as with the two other systems we looked at, is also 4c5. Now 4c5 has almost universally been met by white taking on c5 in master and grandmaster praxis. If instead knight to f3, then either castling or taking on d4 equalize swiftly enough for black. So the move d takes c5 at move 5 for white. And here the first finesse of the system we advocate for black occurs that black castles at move 5, rather than playing knight to a6 or the immediate recapture on c5 with a bishop. Now the idea of knight to a6 with the idea of knight takes c5 is a recurrent theme in the whole 4c5 reply to queen c2. But to play it immediately at move 5 isn't good because of this sequence. 5a3, 6a3 for white, bishop takes c3 check, queen takes c3. Knight takes c5 from black. And now the move f3 from white. And this is the point that white then follows up with e4. Black really doesn't have all that much to show for his giving up the two bishops. Whereas if he waits until white himself puts a knight on f3, then it becomes possible for black to put a knight on the e4 square without having to worry about white playing f3 and e4. It takes an awful long time to arrange that. So that's why black castles at move 5. So the most usual follow-up for white would be 6 knight f3 here. If, for instance, 6 bishop g5, then the move knight a6, consistent with black's system, proved very good in the game of Pietz in 1949. Rather a dated reference, but nobody does bishop g5 very much. That game continued 6 knight a6, 7 a3, bishop takes c3 check, queen takes c3, knight takes c5. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, queen takes f6, g7 takes f6, and black was already completely equal. So if we go back to diagram 2 and look at the move 6 knight f3, I'm going to reply for black 6 knight to a6. Intending to take back on c5 with this piece rather than the bishop, because one of the main ideas of the c5 reply to queen c2 is to give up the king's bishop for the queen's knight and take back on c5 with a knight. And then frequently we see the follow-up of b6, the queen's bishop fianchettoed, and knight from a6, you never know, may go all the way to e4. So after 6 knight to a6, give just a couple of games to illustrate that we think black is doing okay. The first is the game Bagirov-Tal, which was played 5 years ago in Russia. And Bagirov chose to unpin with 7 bishop to d2. You'll follow that Tal took back on c5 with a knight. The move 8 e3 was played by white. Black played b6. White played 9 bishop to e2. Black played 9 bishop to b7. White castled. Sure enough, consistent with all I predicted, black played knight from c5 to e4. Really, already this is comfortable equality for black. Totally neutralising white's opening system. So going back to diagram 2, after 6 knight to f3, 6 knight to a6, one other game we'll give you is the move 7 e3, which was played in Kogan Serowan, USA Championship, also 5 years ago. And there, again, 7 knight takes c5 was played. And Kogan actually chose to provoke black into taking on c3 with 8 a3, which really isn't a particularly profitable use of a move. Sure enough, Serowan took, bishop takes c3 check, 9, queen takes c3, and played now 9 a5. The move 9 b6 was perfectly alright, but this is even more ambitious, because he hopes to fix the white pawns by playing a4 if allowed. Well, he wasn't allowed, because 10 b3 was played, and then 10 b6. So I have the interpolation of these two queenside pawn moves before b6 occurs. 11, bishop e2, and here, seizing on the nuances of the position, black rather more than equalised, which could have been done with bishop to b7, by playing 11, bishop to a6, 12 castles, d5. And as I say, this is rather more than equality for black here. So, from diagram 2, the move 6 knight to f3 isn't really anything to lose any sleep over. And those practitioners of the 4 queen c2 system in more recent years have concentrated upon either 6a3, putting the question to this NIMZO bishop immediately, or some move of the white queen bishop to f4 or to g5. So starting with 6a3, so many times in the NIMZO Indian you have to decide whether to take the knight on c3 or go away with the bishop. Here there is really no option, you must take this pawn on c5 with the bishop. And then now the developing move 7 knight to f3 for white. And there are a variety of ways of trying for equality now with black. Distinguished by whether black wants to play d7 to d5, or whether he'd rather hedge his bets. Play, leave it where it is, the d pawn, or play to d6. So the move 7 knight to c6 is a perfectly good equalizing move here. Now in reply to the move now 8 bishop g5, playing knight to d4 is quite sensible. The point being that after knight takes d4, bishop takes d4. The attempt by white to gain a development tempo with the move 10e3, ostensibly forcing the retreat of this bishop, can be met by the nuance 10 queen a5, when the positional idea of doubling the pawns on c3 compels white to play e3 takes d4. Black can then play queen takes g5, rather an odd way of getting developed, but here the game is steering towards equality. It's actually a sequence from the game Karpov-Portish, 1981. So back to diagram 2, and after 6a3, bishop takes c5, 7 knight f3, knight c6, there's the other move of the queen's bishop to f4 for white. 8 bishop to f4. And here too it's to play d5 or not to play d5. The move (8b6), intending to follow up with bishop to b7 and rook to c8, is what I would advocate here as the best equalizing attempt for black. Though braver spirits might like to look at the game we give Serouan van der Wiel with 8d5, leading to great complications. So the other idea from diagram 2 is the other 6th move for white is 6 bishop to f4. When perhaps the simplest equalizing method is that which is seen in the game Hume Miles, the whole game lasting some 15 moves. But white's hoped for and first move initiative totally destroyed. Play went as follows: 6 bishop takes c5, 7 knight f3, and Miles chose this system not playing d5. He played now 7b6, 8e3, bishop b7, 9a3. Here's the key to his system. He now moved the bishop voluntarily back to e7. 9 bishop e7. 10 rook d1. Pawn from a7 to a6. The idea of this move is to avoid any molestations involving a knight b5. We'll see what happens. White played 11 bishop e2. Black played 11 pawn to d6. White played 12 h3. Not the sort of move to set the world on fire. 12 queen to c7. 13 castles. 13 rook to d8, and black is completely equal here. 14 e4. Knight from b8 to d7. Rook from f1 to e1. Rook from a8 to c8, and here was black at least equal. The game was agreed drawn. So this is the outline of the 4c5 reply to queen c2 in the NIMZO India. Black has the option of following up after he's recaptured on c5 with his bishop, with either an ambitious d5 setup or a less ambitious b6, bishop b7 setup. Alternatively, in the system we looked at with 6 knight to f3 from diagram 2, black playing knight to a6, he gives up his bishop for the knight on c3, usually recapturing on c5 with the knight, and then plays b6, bishop to b7, and uses his possession of the e4 square as compensation for giving up the 2 bishops. This again is one of the main themes of the NIMZO Indian, the control of the square e4 as compensation for the loss of the 2 bishops. Next system we're going to look at is the Leningrad system, which commences with a move 4 bishop g5 from diagram 1, 4 bishop g5. It's called the Leningrad system because it's played by people who came from Leningrad, would you believe? In particular, a man called Vladimir Sak and the great Boris Spassky. It had its vogue, 4 bishop g5. Sort of came back into fashion in the 1970s. It's been seen in recent years occasionally, but the sort of structures that tend to arise are similar to those in the line I suggested against 4f3. You'll see what I mean. So the system we advocate is this: after 4 bishop g5, 4 h6, and the only consequent move now is 5 bishop h4 for white. Taking on f6 is thoroughly innocuous. Black could interpolate the exchange on c3, doubling the white pawns, and then take back on s6. So 5 bishop h4, and then once again the move c5, striking the white centre. Here the only really consistent move is to play d5. Not out of the question to play e3 here. But it's probably best met by taking on d4 for black. C takes d4 in reply to e3. And the move, instead of e3, 6 d5 is almost universally seen. Well, after d5, bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3, d6 is in many ways the starting point of a Leningrad variation in recent years anyway. Because after 8e3 from white, continuing development, 8e5, you see what I mean about the similarity. Black plays 8e5, sorry. The similarity with the system we advocate against 4f3, the same blocked pawn structure. The only real difference here is the white queen bishop is outside the pawn chain. Now this can be rather aggravating, the latent pressure of that bishop on the black king side. If, take some imagining, if white follows up with bishop d3 and knight to e2 and queen to c2 and castles and f4, gets all that in, and the position of the bishop at h4 is certainly better than having it stuck on c1 or d2 behind the pawn chain. However, that's rather estate agents' language for extolling the virtues of having the bishop on h4. Now after 8e5, diagram 3, there are three main continuations for white. Firstly, and least dangerous, is the move 9f4, which has the idea, as I say, of pressuring, using this diagonal h4 d8 to pressure f6. But the simplest way to deal with this really is to take on f4. 9e takes f4, e takes f4. Now queen e7 check, a very disruptive check indeed, forcing white probably to play queen e2, and after the exchange of queens, black has nothing to fear. Or bishop e2, which is a very passive deployment of that piece. I could then follow up with castles. No real problems ahead. The sting has been taken out of the white attack before it got going. So the move 9f4 is most simply met by taking on f4 and then the disruptive queen e7 check. So back to diagram 3, and the two other principal moves are 9 f3 and 9 bishop d3. Now 9 f3 is something of a super refinement in this position over the more obvious move 9 bishop d3. I think it was first introduced by Timmer in the 1970s. We're going to look at a very straightforward continuation for black, very straightforward treatment indeed, again by Ulf Andersson. Again, he played his knight to d7, as in the previously mentioned game with Serouan in the 4f3 system. Here the move 9, knight from b8 to d7. And the first 20 moves of this game with Jan Timman from 1977, Tim Anderson, show both the possibilities and the limitations of this structure for both sides. 10 bishop to d3, by far the most natural square for that bishop. 10 queen to e7. 11 queen to c2. And then the move 11 king to d8. And this is a very noticeable feature of this system, the castling by hand by black. The king is in fact just as safe, if not more so, on c7 than if it was to castle kingside. And to get it to c7, it's just as little trouble to play king d8 to c7 as to go through the process of moving the queen knight, then moving the queen bishop and castling queenside. So 11 king to d8. Very blocked position, one can get away with this king move. 12 knight to e2. Now this knight may become to g3 and then to e4 to f5. So the next move 12 to g5 is also, 12 pawn to g5 by black, is also very much part of the system. Breaking the pin, forcing the bishop to move, of course. 13 bishop to g3, and now king to c7. But in breaking the pin, it's noticeable that a hole has been left at f5. This is the main drawback of having to break this pin. 14 h2 to h4 played Tim, with the threat of winning a pawn, but more importantly, opening the h file. So Andersson countered this with the move rook to g8. Timman took on g5. Andersson took back with a pawn. And now 16 rook to h6. So what white's got going for him really are the diagonals b1 to h7, the h file and the square f5. But black's position is very solid. No obvious weakness apart from the square f5, and it's very, very hard for white to make any progress. Rook h6 was met with 16 queen to f8, 17 rook to h2, knight b6, 18 a4 played white, trying to make progress now on the queen side, 18 bishop d7, 19 a5, back went this knight to c8, 20, king to d2, white again choosing to castle by hand, as did black earlier on. And now Anderson challenged the h5 with rook h8. And again, as with the f3 system, it's more a question of understanding the various themes than concrete rehearsal of lines. The game was in fact drawn in 4 more moves, but it's also very illustrative of the sort of possibilities for both sides. Now, the most active possibility of all from diagram 3 is the move 9 bishop to d3. Now, I mentioned that the move 9 f3 that we just looked at was something of a super refinement, or an attempt at such a refinement, over the most usual, the most logical looking move 9 bishop to d3. And the explanation for the evolution of 9 f3 is found in the best reply to 9 bishop d3, which is 9 e4. Now this pawn cannot be taken because of g5, unpinning and winning one of the white bishops, and also the continuation from here, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, bishop takes e4, queen takes c3 check, certainly isn't good for white. So the bishop must move, and bishop to c2 is the only consequent move. And then, the continuation g5, breaking the pin, 11 bishop to g3, queen to e7, 12 h4, rook g8, h takes g5, h takes g5, knight to e2, knight from b8 to d7, reaches a position which has some similarities with the sort of structure we just looked at, but also some clear differences. The pawn having advanced to e4 closes out completely the possibility of white using the b1 h7 diagonal, and also vacates the e5 square as a possible place for a knight to jump to. (15) Bishop a4. It's a very alert move indeed, because the pin can be annoying. Move 15 bishop a4 was also played in the game Miles-Iskov in 1976, and we give in the accompanying notes the game Williams-Karpov from 1974, showing what happened after the less accurate idea 15 queen b1 from white. So let's just look at the game Miles-Iskov. 15 bishop a4, king d8, bishop takes d7. Not at all an obvious idea. That bishop really had very little scope, so he gives it up for a black minor piece. Black recaptured with 16 bishop takes d7, 17 rook b1, 17 king c7, once again the castling by hand, 18 king to d2 to connect the rooks, 18 knight g4, 19 rook h7, just trying to get as active as possible, 19 rook h8, challenging the h file, 20 queen b3, threatening b7, so black played 20 b6, rook takes h8, rook takes h8, and this position is really equal. In fact, Miles won the game with a few more moves, but that was due to inaccuracies rather than any obvious difficulty facing black here. And so, from diagram 3, those three continuations of f4, f3 and bishop d3, we suggest, we hope will be three viable counters to them. The systems against bishop d3 and against f3 in particular, I emphasize once again, are based more on understanding the memorization. It's a very blocked position, so the often exalted advantage of the two bishops doesn't really count for much for white. Black can afford to get away with unusual ideas like king d8, king to c7 because of the very blocked setup. And frequently a kind of mutual impasse can develop in the middle games. Indeed, one of the main criticisms you could make of the line we advocate here is that it doesn't give much chance for black to play for a win. It's really a very equalising idea to erect a very solid position rather than an enterprising counter-chance position. Next system, the system which is something of an affront to black's whole concept, is the same system, which is from diagram 1 as the move 4a3. You won't be surprised to know that the only sensible reply for black is to take on c3 with check, and white recaptures. Pawn takes c3, reaching diagram 4. Now, the voluntary doubling of the pawns can be a good thing, can be a bad thing. It certainly is the double-edged middle game play. One of the most straightforward systems for black starts with the move 5d6. And this move has been used in a couple of games to good effect, which we're going to give. The game is Diez del Corral Korchnoi, and the game's Tisdall Talbot. Both of these games saw white continuing with the move 6f3, consistent with what we said about white attempting to build up a strong pawn centre. If instead he plays the move 6 queen c2 with the same idea, then something like 6c5, 7e4, 7 knight to c6, and a subsequent e5 from black, which is a very solid position. So 6f3, and now the point of the idea is to play 6 knight to h5. Very odd looking move, but it disrupts the normal flow of white's development, because a move like e3 or e4 is met by queen h4 check, and knight g3 winning the exchange. Or just queen h4 check, forcing the king to move if you don't feel like winning the exchange with knight g3. So the normal flow of development is disrupted, and in both these games, Diez del Corral Korchnoi and Tisdall Talbot, white played 7 knight h3, black played in reply 7 e5 with the devastating threat of bishop takes h3, winning. So white had to play, no choice, 8 knight f2. And then black castled, and white did play e4 now, establishing his centre, but with the king knight on a slightly unusual square. Black replied with 9 knight to c6, and white gained time, but also took risks with the move 10 g4. Forcing the black knight to move. It went back to f6 in both games.
Please turn over to side 2.
It is in the very nature of the samish to play very actively with white, because the position is sharp, always sharp, strategically sharp. And if you don't get on with it, then those double pawns are likely to be something of a headache in the long run. So 11 bishop g5 is played in both of our illustrative games, the most active move there is. Met with 11 b6, preparing the deployment of the bishop. Here the games diverge. Tisdall Talbot went 12 rook a2, 12 bishop a6, and white's next move is already something of a confession that things haven't gone the way he wanted them to go from the opening. 13 c5, which dissolves his doubled pawns, but leaves him in a situation where he has none of the attacking play he'd hoped for and trying to do the same. 13 bishop takes f1, 14 king takes f1, h6, 15 bishop back to e3, e takes d4, c takes d4, d takes c5, d takes c5, queen to e7. Black is thoroughly comfortable here, no problem whatsoever. So from diagram 5, the other game, saw Diaz del Corral, at least being consistent in going for it with the move 12 queen d2, met by Korchnoi with 12 knight a5, with an incidental threat of knight b3, but more importantly hitting the c4 point. So 13 rook b1. Played Diaz, avoiding this fork, and then came bishop a6. So the moment of truth arrives for the Spaniard. The only way to maintain material parity is to play 14 c5. But by analogy with the previous example, after bishop takes f1, 15 king takes f1, d takes on c5, black is doing perfectly alright. The continuation then, 16 d takes e5, queen takes d2, bishop takes back on d2, knight d7 is a nice position indeed for black, with the knight coming to c4 soon, a very pleasant endgame indeed. So from diagram 5, after 12 queen to d2, 12 knight a5, 13 rook b1, 13 bishop a6, Diaz del Corral played the move 14 knight d1, the idea being that this guy might jump into e3, thence to f5 and d5. He decided this was a better way of playing than going into that endgame. Well, Korchnoi played 14 bishop takes c4, then continued to 15 bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, 16 queen d3. And this is the point where Diaz del Corral may have hoped for the knight retreating to a5, whereupon knight to e3, with ideas of knight to f5 and or knight d5 following, would have given him some real compensation. But after 16 queen d3, Korchnoi produced the very fine move 16 d5. And the game concluded 17 castles, h6, bishop to h4, 18 c6, 19 f4. This may look rather precipitate by white, but he's really got to go for it, otherwise he's just a pawn down. 19 e takes f4, 19 e5, and Korchnoi now demonstrated the fine point of his play. So that's 20 e5, 20 g5 by black, breaking the pin. 21 e takes f6, and this is the real point. He didn't take the bishop on h4, he played queen takes f6. The bishop retreated to f2, and then 22 queen e6. Here we can really stop our discussion of the merits of the whole plan, starting with 5 d6 and 6 knight h5. Had white played the logical move h3, 23 h3, black would have replied with 23 queen e4, gaining a pawn roller to go with his 3 very healthy pawns for the piece. In fact, the remaining moves are given on our accompanying notes. Not diagram. Well, 6 f3 from diagram 4 is certainly the most straightforward build-up. As we've seen, the reply knight h5 seems to be reasonable for black. The move 6 e3 from diagram 4 is best countered by 6 e5. Black following up with castles maintaining the strong point at e5. Maintains an equal middle game. It is the build-up with 6f3 which is more critical. So moving on from the same-ish variation from diagram 1, we can look at the move, possibly the most popular move against the NIMZO Indian, 4e3. The Rubinstein variation. Now against this move, this tape advocates, as indeed in so many cases against fourth moves for white, the move c5. And here there are three principal moves for white. Bishop d3, knight e2, and ae3. Other moves tending either to transpose or to be irrelevancies. So from diagram 6, if you look at the first move, 5a3 for white, there are obvious similarities with the system we just looked at, the same system. So after 5a3, bishop takes c3, check. B takes c3, knight to c6 from black, bishop to d3 from white. Black may play the move e5, and white can continue his build-up here. His pawn on d4 is now on prise, of course, with the developing move knight e2. And the system we advocate now for black is to play d6. And maintain, as so often, the solid central form formation. c5, d6, e5. So back to diagram 6. And the exact opposite of the continuation we just looked at, provoking the doubling of the pawns, is the move 5, knight to e2, ensuring that the c-pawns won't be doubled. Now, there are several putative equalizing systems against 5, knight to e2. But the move we're going to suggest is the move 5d5. Here, for once, there's no attempt to establish a d6, e5 pawn formation. It's more of a cleansed centre that's going to arise. After d5, white's most logical attempt for an advantage is to play 6a3. After which black must clearly play bishop takes c3, check. White recaptures with the knight. And now it makes most sense for black to play c takes d4. White to recapture with a pawn on d4. Taking with the queen allows back the tempo knight to c6. And now best for black, my opinion, is to play pawn takes c4. And after the move bishop takes c4, to play knight to c6, attacking the d pawn, development with tempo. Now if white advances with d5, then the complete cleansing of the position leads to an almost sterile equality. So the only way to keep any character in the position is to play bishop to e3. And then black may castle. White may castle. And now the move b7 to b6, preparing the fianchetto of the bishop, is a very logical continuation for black. He tends to follow up with bishop to b7 and then to play, bearing very much in mind the isolated pawn at d4, to follow up with moves, perhaps the maneuver knight e7 to d5 or f5 suggests itself. But we stop our opening analysis here with b6. We give one illustrative game and claim that black is doing at least equal at this point. Going back to diagram 6, what may be regarded as the principal continuation is the move 5, bishop to d3. And against this we advocate a setup which has been called the Hübner system, after the German Grandmaster Robert Hübner. And this continuation arises after 5 bishop d3, knight c6, 6 knight f3 by white. We may note in passing that the move 6a3 would transpose after bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3, e5 to a variation considered earlier from diagram 6. But after 6 knight to f3, the Hübner variation specifically is the continuation bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3, d6. And once again, black telegraphs his intention to follow up with e5. Erecting this blockading structure. Once again, in a block position, we're talking about ideas as much as variations. But the continuations we do examine from here can broadly be distinguished into those where white does play e4 and those where white does not play e4. So firstly then, from diagram 7, 8e4, which is compulsorily met with 8e5, and then 9d5. This move is usually played, attempts to hold the pawn center at d4. It's usually involved the move, if you're not going to play d5, 9h3, because if that isn't played, then bishop g4 from black will almost certainly induce d5. Move 9h3 can be comfortably met by castles from black, castles from white, and b6, while maintaining his strong points. Black can meet the coming middle game with confidence. So, from diagram 7, e4, e5, d5, knight e7. This may look a little surprising when in fact playing the knight to a5, where we're accustomed to see it go, when black has doubled c-pawns, achieves little here because you cannot win the pawn on c4. The most you can do is follow it with b6 and bishop a6, which is simply met by queen e2 or knight d2. So knight to e7 after 9d5 is almost always seen. And the most popular move here, introduced by Spassky in his match with Fischer, is a move 10 knight h4, telegraphing ideas of f4 to open up play on the f file. Fischer's move h6. H6 is particularly effective. After the move 11 f4, and really there are a few other continuations for white, since if f3, then g5 by black anyway, and after the white knight comes to f5, taking it off with the bishop. Is a very comfortable middle game for white, for black, I beg your pardon. So, from diagram 7, e4, e5, d5, knight e7, knight h4, h6, f4. And now, the point of Spassky's continuation was that if black takes on f4, white takes back with bishop takes f4, and the attempt to win a piece with g5 is strongly met by e5, sacrificing material for an attack. But instead, after 11 f4, the move knight g6 has proved very good for black. White is virtually forced to play knight takes g6. Black replies with f takes g6. And once again we see the attempt to maintain a very solid pawn structure from black, to quieten the two bishops, to hope that in the long run the weakness of white's queenside pawns may give black something. I might note in passing that one odd move that occurred to me after 11 f4 was for black to play the move knight d7. I mention this possibility, I give no analysis to it, I leave it to you to look at if you want to play it or examine it. But I note that the move 11 knight g6 is at the very least, totally adequate for black. We'll look at the game in this context, unsicher Timmen, for a while, which after knight g6 continued knight takes g6, f takes g6, 13 castles. Timmen castle, 14 f5 was played. Now, a perfectly reasonable continuation is to take on f5 and follow it with e4. But a highly creative and original idea came from Tim, and he played the move 14 b5. And after c4 takes b5, he played c4. Bishop to c2 to protect the e4 pawn. g6 takes f5. e4 takes f5. Queen to b6 check, point of the sacrifice. King h1. Queen takes b5. With the complex middle game, but certainly black's chances are no worse. That may be considered almost the main line of the Huebner variation, the continuation with knight h4 and f4. If we go back to diagram 7, and after e4, e5, d5, knight e7, of course there are lots of other moves apart from knight h4. One of them was played in the game Najdorf Huebner in 1971, which was to play 10g3. This game continued 10h6, 11 knight h4, g5. 12 knight g2, and white might now hope to follow up with the move h4, levering away at the black king side, but black very astutely followed up with 12 queen a5, 13 queen b3, 13 bishop h3. And this is a very good move because it stops white playing h4 himself. He castled at move 14 to protect his attacked knight. Black castled queenside, very noteworthy move. White played 15 rook b1, the one move threatened mate. Black replied with 15 queen c7. White played 16 f3, and black played 16 king b8. And the stage was set for something like a war of attrition. But I cannot help but feel that black's prospects on the king side are at least as rosy as white's chances of getting anything going against the black king. And in fact, black won a very long strategical game. You haven't heard me say for the first time now that This is very much an idea of understanding the ideas behind the opening just as much as memorizing concrete moves. But in the particular position which arises from diagram 7 after e4, e5, d5, knight e7, one could quote chains of games that have been played, but it's the ideas underlying which are to be understood rather than concrete memorization in this instance, I feel. And as I say, that which approaches a main line, if there is one, is the continuation knight h4, h6, f4, knight g6. But to go back to diagram 7 and examine continuations by white where he does not play e4, then these principally involve the continuation 8 castles. Black plays 8 e5, establishing his pawn formation that he wants with an incidental threat to win a piece. Now the king knight must move. If 9 knight to d2, a move that has been seen, there is a possibility of grabbing a pawn on d4. But apart from being unthematic for black, grabbing this pawn has problems in that it opens up the scope for white's 2 bishops. It does leave black somewhat behind in development. That's not to say it's impossible to take it, but it's certainly not the most natural move in the position. Again, there are lots of ways of maintaining the blockade now for black. Just castling, or even 9 queen to e7. Another possibility, instead of 9 knight d2, is 9 knight g5. And after castles, the move 12 f4. Beg pardon, 10 f4. White has the idea now of taking on e5, maybe then taking on f6 and exchange sacrifice and taking on h7. The other idea being simply to play the knight back to e4. This can be dangerous if black doesn't look out, and one idea is to play here after 10 f4, 10 e takes d4. And if e takes d4, then play the rook to e8, challenging the open file. Or if c takes d4, to take again on d4, white is really compelled to take back on d4. And then the move 12 h6, prodding this knight away. And after 13 knight to f3, 13 bishop to g4, 14 d5, knight to d4, bishop to b2, knight takes f3 check, g2 takes f3, bishop to h3, rook to f2, knight to h5. There are chances for both sides. In the game Benjamin Brown, white has 2 bishops. He also has messed up pawn formation. Speaking personally, I'd rather play black here. Going back to the starting position of this sub-variation, 4e3, c5. One possibility after bishop d3, knight c6, which prevents the Huebner variation, is not to play knight f3, but rather to play knight e2. Taking on c3 isn't productive here. So the move 6 d5 suggests itself. After the continuation 7 castles for white, 7 castles for black, white is forced either to take on c5, which is thoroughly innocuous if black recaptures, or to take on d5, black can either recapture or interpolate a capture on d4, attacking white's own knight, or play the move a3. Now after a3, black plays bishop takes c3, white takes it back, b2 takes c3. And a very natural continuation now for black is to take on c4, white takes back, and now black plays the move e5. Now this move isn't easy to achieve in many of the main lines of the 4 e3 Rubinstein variation because the white knight is on f3. Here it is achieved immediately, and I feel black is already equal completely in this position. So this I'd recommend as a good neutralizer of the subcontinuation e3, c5, bishop d3, knight c6. Now if white wishes to avoid the Huebner variation, knight e2. Going back then to diagram 1, a final move to be examined is the move 4 knight f3. And the reason why I've left this till last is because after the ubiquitous reply 4c5, it really is a question of which other system white wants to go into. Were he now to play 5g3, then after 5 knight c6 we transpose to the 4g3 system examined first on the tape. Were he to play 5e3, then by knight c6 black is angling back into a Huebner system after 6 bishop d3, for instance, bishop takes c3 check. And if white's to play 5a3, then after bishop takes c3 check, pawn takes c3. He finds that having committed himself so early to putting the knight on f3, it's much harder than usual to build up the fast pawn centre we associate with, and which is the main idea of, the sameness variation for white. So none of those three continuations is either dangerous in the case of 5a3 or has any independent value in the case of 5e3 or 5g3. After 4 knight f3 c5, the move 5d5 could be met in a variety of ways, with every hope of equality. I have seen the move 5b5, a pawn sacrifice recommended here, which is not that different to analogous pawn sacrifices that Karpov tried against Korchnoi and Baguio in 1978. But for those of you who don't want to sacrifice pawns, then just 5d6, or taking on d5 and then playing d6 next move, or even the more adventurous 5 knight e4, should all render the putative advantage of the white pieces gone. In this brief survey of the NIMZO-Indian complex, I hope I've given a viable reply to all the main systems white employs. The main idea of the NIMZO-Indian defense is equalizing the white initiative, which aims to establish a sound strategical foundation to inequality. It's not a defense which hopes to imbalance the position all that greatly, as do the Benko Gambit or the modern Benoni or the Dutch defense, merely to equalize first before playing for a win. As such, it remains, as it has over the last 60 years, a highly reputable reply to 1d4, and I hope this tape will be of use to you in employing it. To round off with, here are some illustrative games. The first one is my game with Sakis, from a tournament played in a town that rejoiced in the name of Bor in Yugoslavia. And after the first 3 NIMZO-Indian moves, the game went as follows: 4 e3, 4 c5, 5 bishop d3, knight c6, 6 a3, bishop takes c3 check, 7, b2 takes c3, e5, knight e2. Now at this point on the tape I recommended d6, which is indeed a perfectly viable move, but in fact in this game I played something much more double-edged. I played the advance e5 to e4. White played his attacked bishop back to b1. I played the move b7 to b6, part of Black's very ambitious system as they hit the pawn at c4. White played 10 knight to g3, and I played bishop to a6. Obviously the pawn at e4 is a goner, but in exchange Black hopes to get the one at c4. So White played f3. Now in fact I had this position before versus Andrew Martin at Hastings, 84-85. He played knight takes e4, I played knight takes e4, he played bishop takes e4, and I played bishop takes c4. And this bishop stops White from castling, so in order to get castled he now played his bishop from e4 back to d3. I took it off, he took back with the queen, I played d5, and in this position a draw was agreed, with Black having totally equalised. So if we go back to diagram 8, Sakis in fact played 11 f3. I played 11 bishop takes c4. And in fact this position had occurred before in a game Spassky-Tull from 1957, where after the continuation knight f5, threatening knight d6 check, Tull castled, 13 knight to d6, hitting the bishop at c4, bishop from c4 to d3, bishop takes d3, pawn takes d3, queen takes d3, knight from f6 to e8. The position was perhaps very slightly better for White. In fact, Tull won after Spassky overpressed in a long game. Well, from diagram 8, after f3, bishop takes c4, Sakis played the new move, well, the variant from Tull-Spassky. F takes e4. And now this strong white pawn centre is going to come on with e5, so I played the move d6 to stop it. White played queen to f3. Now this move has the threat of e5, attacking the knight at f6 with the pawn, and the one at c6 with the queen. But the point of Black's complex opening idea is revealed in the next move, castles. Allowing the advance e5, winning a piece. A sacrifice by Black. In fact, if White doesn't play this, he's somewhat stymied for continuation, because the bishop at c4 stops him from castling and bringing his king rook into the play, and also stops him from bringing his queen rook into play from a2, so a plan of development isn't obvious, unless he plays what he actually did play, e5. So I played 14, d6 takes e5. He took the knight at c6, and I played e5 takes d4. Now this continuation was first mentioned almost 30 years ago by Tull, and stopped here, saying he regarded it as being unclear. This position is in fact given in the Batsford book, BCO, Batsford Chess Openings, with the non-committal piece of analysis that it's not clear. Osakis thought for 2 minutes here and played the move pawn from c3 takes d4, after which I think he's lost. So it's useful to look at some alternatives here. White can't castle, his king stuck in the centre, black has 2 pawns for a sacrifice piece and some development lead. He has lots of little ideas like taking the pawn on c3, or playing bishop to d5, and after the queen moves taking the pawn at g2, again with tempo, because of the attack on the rook in the corner. He has the idea of rook e8, keeping the white king where it is. If white plays bishop to a2, hoping to get rid of this irksome bishop, then I think black should reply with bishop to d3, when I think the position is unclear. White still can't castle. He has extra piece, black has only 2 pawns for it, but the white king stuck in the centre is a severe headache. If you go back to diagram 9, instead of bishop a2, if we try the move knight to e4, hoping to exchange off knights, then the move knight to d5 from black, with the idea of queen to h4 check, and then queen to g4, threat of queen e2 mate. And just the general idea of queen to h4 check proves very embarrassing, I think, for white. But I think the best move from diagram 9 is for white to play his queen back from c6 to f3. I think black's best move now is to take on c3, after which I think he has some compensation for his sacrifice piece. He has 3 pawns. I think the best play is from diagram 9, queen f3, d4 takes on c3, e4, attacking the pawn at c3 and also preparing the way to get the queen's bishop out. Queen to d4, with the idea of c2 winning. Bishop to c2, stopping that. Then rook from a8 to e8, with an unclear position, in my opinion. If instead, from diagram 9, queen f3, if black plays the more ambitious move, rook e8, I think he may get the worst of it after the reply e4. I was actually toying with this idea for black. My intention now was to play the move d3, which has the threat of knight takes e4, followed by queen to h4 check, picking up the pinned knight at e4, winning a 3rd pawn. And should white now castle, black can go on with d2, regaining his piece, or winning the rook at f1. But I think from diagram 9 after queen f3, rook e8, question mark, e4, d3, the best move for white is to play bishop g5. This move envisages castling next move, or even just taking on f6, smashing up the black pawns. I think black is in a hard way here, hard to justify his previous play. A quiet move is met, as I've said, by castles or bishop takes f6. The move which caught my attention was the move knight takes e4. A queen sacrifice. White cannot take back on e4, black just takes back on g5, knight on e4 being pinned, and black has a very good position with 3 pawns and very active play. So after the move knight takes e4 in this continuation, the move bishop takes d8 must be played. And this is diagram 10. Well, a queen is a queen, but black has a lot of play for it, but I think he is lost in this position. There are 2 continuations only to be analysed. knight takes g3 check, or knight to g5 check. So starting with from diagram 10, the move knight takes g3 check. The correct move and reply, I think, is king to d1. When, if black takes on h1, white must refrain from playing the tempting move queen takes a8 because of an amazing draw that black has then with the move knight to f2 check, king to c1, rook to e1 check, king to b2, knight to d1 check, king to c1, knight to f2 check, king to d2, rook e2 check, king to c1, rook e1 check, etc. In fact, d2 check would win for black there. That's the dangers of avoiding the draw. So, from diagram 10, knight takes g3 check, king d1. The move knight takes h1 should not be met with queen takes h8, a8 rather, the greedy move, but rather the simple retreat bishop h4. Shows that black doesn't have enough for the queen. So, from diagram 10, knight takes g3 check, king d1. The only other try really is to play bishop to b3 check. I think white must show careful footwork, but I think with king to c1, providing he answers the move then d2 check with king to b2, I think he can successfully demonstrate that black doesn't quite have enough material here. Very complicated, but have a look at it. I think you'll see that black is running out of ideas. The only other possibility from diagram 10, where you're a whole queen down, is to try the move knight g5 check. But I think this is spectacularly refuted by the move queen to e2. There are other possibilities. I think this is the best move, the clearest. When black cannot play pawn takes queen because of bishop takes g5, cannot play rook takes queen because of knight takes rook, I cannot play rook from a8 takes d8 because of queen takes e8 check, and white emerges a rook ahead. This leaves the only real option as d2 check. Here, after king takes d2, white might have a prayer. Black, rather, might have a prayer after rook a takes d8 check, when he's getting quite a bit of material back. But here I think nimble footwork again with the king is winning if white plays instead king d1. Black must take the queen with bishop takes e2 check. White recaptures with knight takes e2. Black must play rook from a8 takes d8. At the moment he has 3 pawns for a piece, but white can round up the pawn at d2 starting with rook a2, and must have very good winning chances when black has just 2 pawns for this piece. So if this analysis is correct, and I think it is, then from diagram 9 the sequence queen to f3, rook e8, question mark, e4, d3, now bishop to g5 seems to give white the advantage. Therefore, instead of rook e8, from diagram 9 up to queen f3, black should substitute d takes c3 with some chances. But what Sakis played after just 2 minutes thought from diagram 9 was c3 takes d4, and this is really a dreadful move, met with the reply rook to e8. And even though black has just 1 pawn for a piece, the white king is trapped in the centre, and there's the terrible threat of queen takes d4 here, supporting the pin on the e-file. Now Sakis admitted immediately after the game that his intention now, this is from diagram 9, c takes d4, rook e8, was to play king f2. But this is spectacularly refuted by the continuation knight g4 check, king g1, queen takes d4. And if pawn takes queen, or even if queen takes rook on e8, check first of all, rook takes e8, pawn takes queen, rook e1 check, knight f1, rook takes knight mate. Since this main line of his defence doesn't work, he was fishing around. And he fished around for an hour before coming up with something else. The principal threat is queen takes d4. If the king moves to d1 or d2, just taking on d4, or prefacing it with rook c8 first and then taking on d4, is extremely strong. One might even consider, after king d2, the move rook takes e3. It isn't necessary, but it may be viable. In fact, after 1 hour, Plaskett produced the move 17, knight to f5. I played the move g6. By playing knight to f5, he protected d4. And if this knight moves now to h6 check, black plays king to g7. We'll probably round the knight up with his king. If the knight moved back to g3, then of course queen takes d4. And if knight to d6, then there is rook to e6, trapping the pinned knight. So he played the continuation he had in mind, which was 18 bishop to a2, hoping to give up some material to disrupt the black king, but this proved inadequate after the continuation g6 takes f5, 19 bishop takes c4, 19 queen takes d4, black managing to implement his main threat. I should point out now that if white plays queen takes a8, hoping to deflect the pinning black rook from e8, then black can interpolate the move queen to c3 check, winning. So in this position, Plaskett chose the move 20 castles, after which black has no choice but to play the move 20 queen takes a1. Now a head count reveals that black is the exchange and 2 pawns up here, but it's not that, or not entirely trivial to win the game, because white has some chances due to the disrupted black king position and also the 2 bishops. But it's very hard for him to make any progress here with his attack because of the inactivity of the c1 bishop, which is the theme of the game and many of the variations in the game. It's very hard to activate this piece, and even here, if white plays e4, he runs into the continuation queen to d4 check, king h1, 22 queen takes c4, attacking f1, winning a piece. Black is in a rook up. So Plaskett produced a move here which is really semi-desperation, g4. I managed to finish off the game with this continuation. 21, knight takes the pawn at g4, 22 h3, and now a knight retreat won't do. Knight to f6 or knight e5 won't do because of queen to g2 check and bishop b2, turning the tables. But instead I played 22 queen to c3, attacking the bishop at c4. And his last throw was to play bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, h3 takes g4, but I managed to consolidate with rook from a8 to d8. And the game concluded queen to h6, king to g8, and in severe time trouble, Plaskett played 26 g4 takes f5, allowing the retreat 26 queen from c3 to g7 check, exchanging off into an endgame, the exchange and a pawn up, and therefore here he resigned. I hope this game and some of